Let me know when we're live, Branavi.
Yeah. And we're live.
Great. All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this virtual launch. I'm the editor-in-chief of Adi Magazine, and I'm delighted to be here with a number of contributors from the issue who, over the next hour or so, will be reading and reflecting on their work. First, a little bit about Adi. As many of you know, Adi is a quarterly literary magazine with an interest in the lived experience of policy and politics, with a particular focus on the marginal, the global South, communities bearing the brunt of decisions made by the powerful. And we have a tendency toward kind of creative, experimental approaches to policy writing, a fairly open-ended conception of what might constitute policy discourse. So for this latest issue, Unpeopled Terrain, we take up the complexities and contradictions of environmental policy in the midst of our climate emergency. And of course, as world leaders are preparing to convene for COP26 in just a few days, we consider how climate interventions can deliberately or inadvertently undermine the lives of those on the margins. And in this issue, we really strive to center communities whose ecological ethic kind of long predates today's notions of conservation and sustainability. So I will introduce our contributors kind of as they read, and also bring in a few questions along the way. Also, audience, please type your questions into the YouTube live chat, and they can be addressed to specific people or the whole group, and we'll ensure that there's a bit of time at the end to address as many as we can. So first, I would like to introduce Karen McCarthy-Wolf. Karen is a poet whose latest book, Seasonal Disturbances, explores the climate crisis, migration, the city, and the sacred. She's also been a poet in residence at UCLA's Promise Institute for Human Rights. And I think Karen is a great person to start us off, as her poem really speaks to this kind of open-ended approach to policy writing that Adi seeks to cultivate. So Karen, welcome, and we'd love to hear your piece.
Hi, Mira. Thank you. Yeah, it was really great to get the invitation. I suppose particularly coming back from UCLA and there where I was really thinking about ways in which poetry and law might interconnect, really, in the expression of of human rights and issues around the climate crisis. And for a while, my work has focused on aspects of enclosure. In fact, this was before the pandemic and before lockdown. That was what I was really sort of thinking about there. In Seasonal Disturbances, the book that you mentioned, I suppose one of the things that I was really thinking about was the refugee. I was responding in some of that book to issues around the Mediterranean refugee crisis, and then ideas around gentrification as another form of involuntary displacement for communities via kind of like strong economic pushes. So I mean, the only other thing I might say to just before I go ahead and read the poem is that I sort of feel that for a lot of us, when we think about climate crisis, we're often thinking about what can I do, what can the individual do, that sort of feeling of kind of almost helplessness in the face of something that feels so big. And I think that one of the things that sort of poetry does in this space is enables us to, I suppose, sort of think about the micro, to actually articulate and log the micro, the complexities within that, the nuance within that. So those are just sort of, I suppose, just a little sort of context to the piece, which I'll read now in a second. Let me just grab it here. Why does it decide to disappear now? Yeah, very interesting. Bear with me, if you will. It's a screen issue, so sorry. Here we go. Yeah, so this is Field Notes from the 21st Century. It's a photo lyric in the magazine, so you'll see some images with it, and that's something that I've been doing increasingly, is working with photographs as well. Field Notes from the 21st Century. Rattle of a sieve upstairs, metal in a kitchen, a picture window with views to wide and tended lawn. A familiar wood pigeon crows, of course. Elsewhere, brash green squawks of climate opportunists, escapees. A festival groans in the park, fenced in, monetized, helicopter blades chopping the wind, so all that industrious gossamer spun between valerian and honeysuckle shudders. And yes, its subtle geometries hold. Air traffic has resumed, white streaks across sky punctuated by intermittent barks, a noisy fly that does eventually depart amongst innocent memories of aerosol and squashy white bread. Birdsong is ambient, occasionally identified on an app soon to be rendered obsolete. All this with my feet barefoot on the ground, earthed amongst the luxury of purely decorative plants, although no such thing exists, only arrogant space that recognizes only its own colonies, only mundane taxonomies, not without utility or purpose, but limited, yes. An empty birdcage hangs from the bare trunk of an old rose. No bird has flown in or out or attempted to nest, even though the little trapdoor hangs open like a tongue, which propels my chain of thought to yesterday, when I saw a GPS dog collar in the aisle, only $12.99, so no dog might ever get lost or flee or dodge the stick with an endangered wife, the kids. Feet, toes, soles on clammy grass and clover, earthed by negative ions, a prescription from Sula, Black woman healer, who says it will ease the inflammation in my spine. And it does soothe, cools, as if I might be underwater, under sea, briefly rolling. It's hard to trust the ground these days, though my dad's bequeathed marigolds are thriving, now they're free from my absent-mindedness. Trying to remember and simultaneously forget how seagulls congregate at the rubbish tip, their greasy monochrome bodies huddled against red cliffs, the stink of rotten this and that, the sea edging closer while we watch men who name themselves Theo launch and burn, only to disappoint by coming back, as the sea must bear its lunar tide, raise hurricanes in defense. That is the end.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you so much. Really, really stunning and powerful piece. And you started to talk about this a little bit already, but I'd just kind of like to ask you a bit about how you approached this poem and kind of the brief, really, because, you know, of course, much of your work explores climate change. You've also done interdisciplinary research involving poetry and law. So I'm kind of curious to just hear you reflect on how you think about bringing policy and poetry together, particularly with regards to climate.
I think sort of I touched on that a little with this sort of idea of, you know, how we kind of might start to, you know, think about those nuances in our lives, and the way that maybe the way that policy might be communicated to people as a sort of dialogue, as a communication between the two things. I mean, I'm conscious that we sort of worry about recycling, and, you know, I have a poem in Seasonal Disturbances, which is about, you know, kind of like getting stressed out because I ordered a coffee and then I got the plastic lid by mistake, and then there's a straw, and then there's this, and then there's that. But, you know, we know that actually we need to also engage, you know, huge corporations and government, you know, in terms of, you know, enacting, you know, to create law and to follow it. In fact, the Promise Institute, Kate McIntosh, who's the director there, I mean, you know, she's actually sort of actively working at the moment on writing international law for ecocide. And the thought that actually, you know, that a climate perpetrator might, you know, even to think of a company or a government as a climate perpetrator, to me, that's an interesting idea. And, you know, in a lot of ways, I'm very interested in those nuances of language, about how language is used, you know, used in law, and how we, you know, we're very kind of alert to that in poetry as well. But the idea that you could have somebody that is then, you know, then, you know, with the International Criminal Court, you know, for perpetrating ecocide, for perpetrating a crime against the planet, you know, that is exciting to me. I'll say just a tiny bit more, which is that, you know, poetry has a long tradition of, you know, nature poetry. And within nature poetry, we might have ideas around the pastoral, we might have ideas around, you know, a sort of romanticized bucolic. But yet we know that as much as we want to rejoice and celebrate what we do have in the natural environment, the non-human environment around us, there's also what we might call a poetic of witness. And that poetic of witness is to actually record what is actually happening to the environment. And within that environment, I think that the human beings, the communities of humans, are part of nature. And it's this idea of this separation between, you know, human communities and nature, which I think has actually been artificially constructed via industry and capitalism. You know, that's actually what separates nature, because it's actually seeing nature as a commodity. You know, so those are some of the things that I feel that, you know, are exciting to be able to express through poetry as an art form, in a way which I hope, you know, poetry has this capacity to perhaps, you know, connect to the here and now, to the moment, to that moment. And it's not, and to express sort of some of those imperfections which we inevitably all live through.
Well, speaking of the here and now and kind of interesting and insidious uses of language, I want to bring in Tamara Tolles O'Loughlin, who is paying attention to the congressional hearings that are going on right now, and only has a few minutes to be with us. But Tamara did a fantastic interview with my colleague, George, who's an environmentalist, former North America director of 350.org. Hello, Tamara. In the interview that you did with Jory, you very clearly, you know, talk about how the climate crisis really should be paid for by the people who started it, and you're now listening to oil executives. And so tell us what you're hearing and seeing, and whether you think that can happen.
Sure. I mean, I think if Congress is doing it, it is somewhat of an inevitability in the U.S. So, I mean, essentially, the wheels of this institution move to slow things down. So if they're projecting it, it's definitely happening. I think this conversation about whether or not reparations will be paid a foregone conclusion, but the question is how, under what mechanisms, and to whom. And I think it's really important for those of us who can see the writing on the wall and those who feel it in their bones to be vocal about that, so that it gives some space for the means to come about. And I think that's the crux of the conversation, is that people have been raising that if you break something, you bought it, ever since every one of us learned that as a principle of operating in community with others. Finding a way to get that into the mechanism of how sectors work, of how governments work, so that the most basic rules of operating in community matter when we have agreed to do something. And it's something we agreed to do is to have power that delivers people basic needs, and how we do that is a part of the social agreement. So it feels kind of absurd to be in this moment where we're talking about the will to do it as a part of a political conversation, when really the political conversation is a secondary or tertiary expression of how we show up amongst agreements that we've made to be in community together. We were born into some agreements, and it is my central, I think, purpose to constantly remind people that we can redesign them. We shouldn't be looking at agreements made by other folks who have passed on or transitioned as sacred texts, unless they somehow have meaning to us now, because when we're gone, people will do the same.
Well, I feel like, the question of what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks at COP26 is really on people's minds. And this question of kind of how to break inertia on policy discussions and not sort of making the same choices and living in the same realities that we've been living in. So I suppose, another sort of really interesting point you made in the interview is you said, I've never been in a room where fishermen don't understand climate change, but I've been in plenty of rooms with politicians who are trying to keep the status quo. So, as we sort of go into the next couple of weeks about to see rooms full of politicians, do you see space for this kind of lived experiential knowledge you describe, particularly from the Global South? And not just knowledge, but leadership.
No, thank you for this question. I think, especially in the global space, in COP, people have fought for 25 COPs to make sure that the knowledge we already have, the leadership ways that we express at the level of community, and the ways that we have allowed the social contract to make everything else possible, means we not only have a seat at that table, excluding us from it means the work of the table doesn't have meaning, right? So I do think at this next juncture where we can see the writing on the wall for climate, where colonialism has lost its sexy mysticism for the three people who ever benefited from it, that we are in a place where Indigenous leadership, which is really about relationship to land, and it's true for every person who has an identity related to land, there are tons of openings for demands for climate reparations, for land-based reparations, for equity in policymaking, for promises to return the land to people who never asked to be created, to be set up across separations that are legal in identity, that belong to colonialist powers. Those are decisions that we didn't all agree to. And so I think the reckoning of those things in spaces like COP is always coming in the side events, in the meetings that happen, in the unconferences that happen across the street, and are rapidly moving into the blue and green zones where we can no longer pretend that this is not happening. The current version of that in COP looks like the pandemic creating a little bit more space to divide people, but not in any real way, not in any natural way, and not in any way that makes sense for doing good governance work. So my hope is that whatever happens and doesn't happen at COP will be the foreground for a much larger conversation about why we decided this is where we're going to make decisions, especially in the world of vaccine inequity, which is just another form of this discussion about what people are owed in the social contract. So I'm excited for this event, like all of these activities, because they put a mirror up on what we agreed to and invite more people to beg the question.
Well, I think that several of the pieces in the issue kind of really explore this question of local knowledge and kind of how to translate experiences and kind of lived behaviors that communities are pushing into I guess, strategies that the rest of the world can also learn from. So we'll get into that a little bit more with Rux's piece, but before you have to go, I guess I'm kind of curious about how you see that working. I mean, this balance that kind of needs to be struck in this moment of urgency between the need for sort of large scale change and the power of kind of uniquely developed kind of smaller scale solutions.
So I think the world is wrapped in a conversation about scope and scale, only because due to technology, we have the ability to see more of us than we've ever been able to. But I think these kinds of questions about how do we get folks with disparate interests, different point of views to a place of agreement has always been on the table, because no group of people is a monolith. Like, even if they share same cultural traditions and the same language, there are people with different opinions. And the idea that we lead by deciding who the winners and losers are, or creating spaces where consensus means the people with the least amount of power get pushed out, those aren't things that work at any scope or on any scale. And so what I think is really possible in this moment of digital connectivity, of lots of means to communicate across the work through our ways of working, through our stewardship and our knowledge, is also an invitation for us to connect so that we can upset the balance in favor of the most of us as instead of what we've been doing. So it does feel like we are in a unique moment for us that will help decide the terms of engagement for an entirely different set of people. And if we don't take that into our bodies, and if we don't take that into our demands, and we don't take that into our language, we will not hand that over to other people who deserve to have a fighting chance. So I'm excited to be a part of this incredible event and this publication, because I think all of us are speaking to what we need in this moment, what we see in the future, and what is not going to work for us as we hand over the reins. And however long that takes, we have some work to do to make sure what we're handing over is a thing that's worth carrying. And I will speak for myself as a person I call it, I'm middle-aged, I'm in the middle of the seesaw. I have a responsibility to look at both ends and feel a little bit human and try to extend my hand. So I'm excited to be in this virtual room full of other folks who are doing the same.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I think this is a good moment to bring in Anna Badkhen, whose piece really kind of was helped us think through the theme of this issue. So Anna is a nonfiction writer, author of 6 books. Her essay collection, Bright Unbearable Reality, is out from New York Review Books next year. And her fantastic piece for us, Ways of Unseeing, like I said, really speaks to the theme of this issue, the ways in which vulnerable are often erased in moments of crisis, and sort of the ways through that. So Anna, welcome, and we're excited to hear an excerpt from your piece.
Thank you very much for having me. It is a real honor to be here and to speak to such a profound group of thinkers. I'm very excited to be in the room with you. And thank you for having this piece in the magazine. In 1683, in El Paso del Norte, the city we know today as Ciudad Juárez, a local leader named Juan Sabiata met with the Spanish colonial governor and listed for him the names of some of the people who lived among the calderas and high plains and mesas and arroyos of his part of the northern Chihuahuan Desert, in what is now the Big Bend region of Southwest Texas. A Spanish scribe recorded the names in his ledger: the nation that grinds, the nation of the ugly arrows, the people of the ugly water, the people who eat, the people of the nut, the people of the alligators, the people of Tanacue and of Toapa, the people called Tujaja, Penunde, Tijemo, Toajo, Imiti, Geabori, Kokuma, Teanama, Obori, Ariuman, Itaka, Tumpotokwa, Mana, and Kide. The people called Eat Horse, the people called Bean, the people called the Deaf Ones, the people who make bows. The Borobamo Nation, the great kingdom of Teas, or Kado, the very widespread nation of Kutas, and the widespread nation of Umanas, made up of 36 different nations. Sabeata himself was Humano. Sabeata told the Spanish that there were, in his desert, many more nations that he did not name. What was the purpose of Sabeata's list? The archives tells us that Sabeata was a shrewd diplomat who had, in the words of the historian Nancy Parrott Hickerson, mastered the conventions of Spanish officialdom and wanted to encourage the Spanish invasion of his desert because, in his projection, the better armed conquistadors would protect Pueblo nations from their enemies, the Apache. Perhaps he was trying to demonstrate to the colonizers the abundance of souls their missionaries could claim for conversion. Perhaps, like many people under occupation before and since the world over, he gambled that forging an alliance with the colonizers would stave off destruction. But the conquistadors envisioned the desert mostly as a route to strata of silver and mineral and pasture. In coming years, to simplify things, they opted to ignore Sabeata's catalog of his neighbors. The landscape of their imagining was devoid of human life, and their maps called his land El Despoblado, the unpeopled. What does unpeopling a place permit? It permits exploitation and erasure of environments, and immediately or in the long run, the human communities these environments contain and sustain. It's an orientation and a strategy, one that sanctions the homicidal myopia that has fueled colonial greed, past and present, and that continues to shape our world. The archive, the journalist Alize Kohari reminds us in the pages of this magazine, is historically bound to power. The World Archive wound its way into the English language from the Greek ta archeia, public records, plural of archeion, public building, itself a derivative of arche, which means government, but also beginning, origin, first place. The archive, by definition, declares primacy before there be nothing, emptiness, el despoblado. Unpeopled, a space belongs to no one because no one, that is, no one the archive deems human, is there, and so is available for the taking. Maybe Sabeata had a premonition. Maybe by listing the many peoples of his desert, he was trying to trick the archive into remembering who was there in the beginning, in the first place, before colonization by the Europeans, to trick it into preserving the primacy of the desert's peopled nature. Perhaps to him, the land was inextricable from its people. They were parts of one ecosystem, one nature. Nature is what is, everything that has been, and everything that is possible, including human actions, inventions, creations, and imaginations, writes the poet Patty Ann Rogers. The recognition of such homogeneity complicates the false separation between humans and nature that often drives conversation policy today, but that also paves the way for the abuse by man of the Earth's resources.
Thank you so much, Anna. It's really such a rich piece. There's so much there and kind of so much to digest. I'd urge everyone to, if you haven't already, go and read the full versions of these pieces. I'm going to have Ruxandra Guidi read next, and then I'm going to ask both of you a kind of related question. So Ruxandra Guidi has been telling stories for over 2 decades on public radio and podcasts and magazines across the US, Caribbean, South and Central America, and Mexico. And her essay for this issue explores the very real tension between, as we've kind of discussed a little bit already, top-down kind of large-scale environmental policy interventions and the efforts local communities have been making for centuries to coexist with and nurture the natural world. So Ruxandra, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, and it's great to be here with y'all. I'll just say a few words about this story before I read an excerpt. Back in 2008, I had just come back from reporting in Haiti, and I wanted to do a story actually about efforts to really grow back forests in areas that have been largely deforested, especially alongside the border with the Dominican Republic. And I pitched this to a funder, and they instead encouraged me to take a look at how the Guna people in Panama were fighting this thing called RED. At the time, it hadn't been really much in the news, and I had no idea. I'd never reported on climate offsets, or this basically what would become a large global UN IMF-led carbon offset market. So that's how the idea came about. It's probably the only story I've done where I didn't come up with the idea myself. And it's definitely been a tough one to unpack. It's taken me about a decade to really get at what it means, but here goes. I had come to a stoop to talk to Don Jesus about Paduala, the Guna creation myth about an enormous coconut tree that fell in the Caribbean. As it touched the water, its long leaves turned into a fan of islands. The Guna, he tells me, believed the earth was deserted until their god Babtumat created the first tree named Wago, a deeply rooted magical being with a soul, much like a human. Wago was the father of all trees, and from him came all the forests. Before a tree is cut for building materials or to make room for planting, men must sink to Wago, asking for his permission. Don Jesus gets his eminence from his grandfather, Nele Cantule, an adivino or prophet, who supposedly could foresee a range of events, from weather to politics. From the time he was 10 years old, he began to learn directly from the spirits. He could predict when it was going to rain and when the winds were about to blow so hard they would cause damage to the islands. He once had a vision of a Guna Yala free from Panama's occupying rule. And in 1925, when he was 57, Cantule led the San Blas Rebellion that would make Guna Yala an independent and sovereign indigenous territory within the Central American country, among the first of its kind in the Western Hemisphere. It is thanks to this legacy of self-determination, this stubborn connection to ancestral lands and to Wago and Babtumat, that Guna Yala still has one of the best preserved old-growth tropical rainforests in the region. Almost a decade since that meeting with Nele Cantule's grandson, I can still zoom into the satellite image of their territory online, roughly 925 square miles along the northeastern coast near the border with Colombia, where a continuous band of light green stands out in a landscape pockmarked development. There is a twist to the Guna creation myth, one I heard from other wise men across Guna Yala. Wago would eventually abandon his role as forest protector and become cocky, believing himself greater than the god who created him. Babtumat had to send Wago back to the fourth level of the universe, where he remains. The story is told to children as a cautionary tale, so they learn that they cannot do as they please in the forests. The Gunas say that finding a balance with the natural world is what distinguishes them as a people. When I first visited in 2009, the Gunas' approach to conservation and their stretch of healthy forests were drawing the attention of the backers of a global program designed to fight climate change. The program is called RED+, or RED, Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Degradation, a UN and World Bank supported climate change mitigation scheme. The program aims to reduce forest loss worldwide by paying developing countries to set aside carbon-absorbing tropical forests in order to offset pollution by mostly industrialized ones. In April 2007, representatives from the Panamanian government met with World Bank officials in Berlin to hammer out a lucrative carbon offset deal that involved Guna land. As long as tropical rainforests weren't felled in Panama, $12 million from REDD funders would come to the Panamanian government. But first, officials needed to secure approval and participation from all the people living in those forested areas. Unlike Panama's other indigenous peoples, according to the Constitution, the Guna have total control over their own land. The prospect of having to set any of their land aside was difficult for the Guna to grasp, given their hard-won sovereignty, coupled with the fact that they don't believe in rigid no-cutting policies. As long as they stick to their methods of incremental communal farming and long periods of regeneration, they believe that their management will keep the forest in good condition. The elders also wanted to know, did the Guna own not just the land and the trees, but also the trees' carbon rights? Once the carbon credits were traded, where would their value and cash end up? But most notably, why should the Guna sign up to a program to avoid deforestation when they've been doing that for millennia and without financial incentives?
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Such a fascinating piece, and if you read on, you learn what happened, and the Guna's very kind of confident rejection of REDD, and something I think is that's really interesting to bring up in the context of COP26 is what the Guna kind of did after, which really involved kind of educating interested groups, communities from around the world about their strategies. So I wonder, Rux, if you can talk a little bit about that, about these kinds of alternative conferences that developed in the wake of the rejection of REDD.
Sure thing. So one thing that's fascinating about the Guna as a people is that they, over the past 20, 25 years, they have, migrated out to Panama City in larger numbers, seeking jobs, seeking an education, and a large number of Guna men and women who were traditionally from the islands have gone on to study biology, conservation biology. This has positioned them really in a way to make a case for their forests, for themselves, for their people in particular ways. And by the time that I first went to Guna Yala in 2009, I met a number of Guna biologists who had been attending COP meetings and other world meetings relating to climate change, discussing issues of forest conservation, carbon offsets, managed retreat, all the things that we are now talking about in relation to climate adaptation. And they really felt sidelined. They were among the loudest voices in demanding inclusion of Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous spirituality, and the conservation of global South forests. So, the process of saying no to REDD was actually quite long. It took years. It took, I visited back to a stoop maybe 5 times over the course of 6 years. And it really took about that long from the moment that I mentioned the IMF earlier. It wasn't the IMF, it's the World Bank. But from the first time that the World Bank tried to recruit them into REDD until they finally said no, about 6 years went by. And since then, they really saw strength in aligning their forces with their Indigenous peoples. And so they've created a very grassroots, homegrown, DIY network of Indigenous leaders, most of them young Indigenous leaders who really are still knocking on the doors of COP and trying to be included in those global conservation discussions, but they're really organizing and discussing, a more holistic approach to conservation that is not one size fits all, that is not, carbon carbon offset driven, which is what red has managed to do. Carbon has dominated that discussion globally and has really pushed this as a one size fits all model. And largely, after the Guna rejected red, we've seen a lot more smaller indigenous communities across the global South kind of join in with the Guna in opposition to red. And red right now is kind of, it's still ongoing. The results are mixed. And, I think a lot of leadership in the UN would say perhaps it's because not enough communities and countries as a whole have signed up, but there's been steady opposition from a lot of indigenous communities in particular around the global South because they feel, they feel confused. They feel like this is just colonization with a new name, basically the same questions I asked at the end of this excerpt, right? Who did the carbon rights belong to? And what advantage do we have as indigenous peoples in fighting this thing and coming together alongside our own, according to our own principles, according to our own sense of spirituality? So yeah, the Guna, I think, still feels sidelined by the powers that be, but they have been steadily building up this network of indigenous opposition to red, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, really, this idea of putting people who are most affected at the heart of policy decisions. And Anna and Ruxandra, both of your pieces, raise this issue of unpeopling landscapes and erasing people from the picture, deeming places that are full of life either empty or untouched as a kind of strategy for exploitation. So I wonder actually if you could both reflect a little bit on that idea of kind of what unpeopling means, both as a strategy, but also as a frame, as we're doing here to critique policy. Maybe, Anna, we could start with you.
Maybe unpeopling is a term for dehumanizing, and dehumanizing is a term for not having to account for or not having to account to. So everything that all that we're talking about today, about accountability, about reparations, about rights, unpeopling, emotional unpeopling, intellectual unpeopling, allows capitalist powers, colonialist powers to avoid accountability and avoid responsibility. But I'm not a policy thinker as much as so many other people here on this panel. But in my understanding, Karen was talking about nuances of language earlier. And I keep coming back to that thought, the nuances of language, the concept of climate perpetrator, how we use language often allows us to get away with things or holds us to account, which is why we have publications, which is why we're trying to prize apart policy through language and through the podium of a literary magazine. Language is a powerful tool, and it is also a tool that allows us to strip away power. Mm-hmm. That's where unpeopling comes in.
I like that analysis a lot. I would add that, from conquest, slavery, colonialism, genocide of indigenous peoples across the world, all of that has been built on the idea that some people are better than others, right? That some people hold, there are winners and losers. Land and territory are at a premium, and some places can be unpeopled for some of those benefit, right? To benefit those winners. And one thing that would always come up in my conversations in Guna Yala was that, the World Bank, the UN, the big NGOs that wanted in on this carbon offset model would like to think that the Guna's forest is virginal, right? It's unpeopled. It's just full of trees that have a value, both to the Guna and to the West, and that value is financial, right? At the end of the day, people are gonna keep from felling those trees if they realize what each of those trees is worth. That framework in and of itself made no sense whatsoever to the Guna people, and doesn't make sense if we are willing to, most of us, if we're willing to remove ourselves from our Western drunken capitalism view of the world, right? And it's problematic. I think the Guna so eloquently described to me just one. I mean, they tried, I think, and still, I think my upbringing and my own culture kept me from truly understanding the depth of their spiritual connection to their land, to trees. It's something I respect and I try to do justice to in my piece, but it's still something that is quite fuzzy to me as someone who's an atheist, and who just doesn't see spirits. That said, I absolutely think they had a very concise way of describing how the value, the worth of these forests go far and beyond the actual practical uses of the wood, right? Or the fact that they can grow in these forests. And that's something that I feel like, the Western powers, since the time of conquest, of colonization, have just have completely, we've tried to erase it from the historical record, right? We've basically just we've taken away other people's voices and perspectives on these landscapes. And yes, this idea of unpeopling, of there being land that is virginal is such a myth, right? It's impossible. We find uses for these places that sometimes we can't even really describe, but that does not mean that they're any less worthy. It does not mean that they can be conquered, that they can have they can be commodified.
May I piggyback on what you're saying? I love the piece, by the way. It's such a powerful piece, and it's a powerful piece because there is a resistance, and you describe very powerfully the resistance of the Guna people to the unpeopling of the forest. But lest we get lost in the esoteric, of the terminology, we are also talking about how intellectual unpeopling leads to factual unpeopling. We're talking about genocide. We're also talking about how scientists are predicting that by 2070, a third of the planet will be uninhabitable. So the real crime of language, of unpeopling linguistically, or unpeopling intellectually, or assigning different value to different lives. That's where we are now. That's our human history, or at least the history of white supremacy. But also that is a very tangible danger of the present and the future.
Absolutely, and I think kind of a lot of what you're pointing to is really interestingly expressed in a piece of speculative fiction in this issue by Chinelo Onwualu. Of course, so much of the discussion around climate change is about anticipating what might happen. And I was so delighted to have this piece in the issue because it does this imaginative work of envisioning the sort of dangers of a post-fossil fuel world, and also speaks to this kind of latent uncertainty and the sort of supernatural that drives what might happen. And so I'm really happy to introduce Chinelo. Her stories have featured in various anthologies and magazines. She's the co-founder of Omenana, a magazine of African speculative fiction. Chinelo, would love to hear an excerpt from your piece.
Well, thank you for having me. A little bit about this piece before I start. So I've been working as kind of, speculative fiction does not always pay the bills. So for a few years now, I've been working with nonprofits on climate-related issues in West Africa, about since 2012. And one thing that I'd always noticed was how sort of climate solutions were often offered from a single point of view and single source and presented from like these large organizations in North America and Europe to African governments with no expectation of or understanding of what was already on the ground. So when implemented, they never took into account local conditions or existing cultural, social structures, or even existing power relationships, and would often end up making things worse. So the story is about unintended consequences in a world that's moved from reliance on one kind of power source to another wholesale without really thinking about diversifying or even dismantling the power structures that undergird all, the world that we see today. And it's about essentially a group of environmentalists who turn to an unusual ally when all their other options run out. So let me start. The title is The Lamentations of a Veteran of the Sand Wars. I'm honestly not sure how my clients find me. There must be some kind of network where they trade the names of mediums and such supernatural types. Normally, I'm going about my life and they just show up. I mean, I was pricing tomatoes at the market when the environmentalist approached me. To be fair, unlike my usual clients, he was still alive. Adewale Momo, asked the skinny man, his Adam's apple bobbing as he spoke. I eyed him up and down. Clean but faded Okrika clothes, locally made leather sandals, an afro and beard so thick that they looked like they could knock him over at any moment. Typical good do-gooder type. I could see he was intimidated by me. Understandable. I'm nearly 7 feet tall, bald, built like a Senegalese land wrestler, and all the scars from my time as a soldier in the corporate armies of the climate wars. That can be frightening if you don't know me. Call me hungry, I told the man, to try to put him at ease. He nodded warily. Samuel Amosu, he said. We shook hands, my meaty paw engulfing his. I would like to discuss something very important, the thin man continued in a rush. Is there somewhere we can meet? 30 minutes later, I had him situated in my room and Palo Place at Ojota. Perched primly on a settee with a cold drink in hand, Samuel explained why he had contacted me. 2 weeks ago, in the small riverine community of Ajido, just outside Badagry, unknown gunmen broke into the home of a woman named Kudirat Olayinka and shot her while she slept. She'd been the head of Samuel's small environmental NGO, a group known as Save Our Beaches, SOB for short. She was one of the very few young people who'd chosen to return home after studying overseas, and she'd taken over from the organization's previous head. Kudirat turned out to be a brilliant strategist. Under her leadership, the group began organizing with more cleverness and sophistication. Within a few years, they'd started winning lawsuits against local polluters and drawing media attention. As Samuel talked, I realized I'd actually heard about them. It wasn't every day that a tiny fishing village dared to stand up against a multinational corporation like Globex Extractive Industries, one of the largest sand miners in the world. Yet, somehow, they've done exactly that, and even won a reprieve for many mining activities in the community. Then, suddenly, Kudirat was dead. Local police declared it an armed robbery gone wrong and closed the case. But both Samuel and I knew the truth, though. Globex did not like to lose. When I was born, at the beginning of the 22nd century, the world was choking under the weight of devastating disasters. Much of it could be traced to its addiction to petroleum and a capitalist system that devoured everything it touched to enrich a small corporate overclass. It took a series of conflicts we came to dub the climate wars to free us from some of the problems, at least. About 10 years ago, in 2153, the last armistice of the wars was signed. A recovering world focused on solar power as the sole solution to all the damage that had been caused by plastic and petrochemicals. Today, our skies and land are clearer. And in many ways, we are well on our way to reversing the climate catastrophe that our dependence on petroleum created. But like any miracle cure, our over-reliance on solar power has had its own side effects. Most people don't realize it, but sand is one of the most important raw materials in the world. It is the core of permacrete, the world's new favorite building material since coal-based tar was banned, and it's used in all silicon-based technology, including solar glass. Today, sand miners are the largest and most powerful corporate conglomerate on the planet. They have solidified their hold on the world's economy the same way the petro bosses did a century ago, and the way the robber barons of the 19th century did, through bribery and violence. However, like sand, like oil, is finite, and we are quickly running out of it. Having exhausted most land quarries, sand miners have been turning to the water, vacuuming up millions of tons of sand from riverbanks, beaches, and the seabed every year. Multinational sand mining companies like Globex prefer to work in international waters beyond the jurisdiction of nation states and corporations, where mining rights might fall under the eye of a country or a corporation's land holdings. These multinationals rely on local miners to dredge sand on their behalf. This is where you find the sand mafias.
Thank you so much, Chinelo. Really interesting story, full of wild adventures. And what I loved about it, I think, was just kind of how expansive it felt, even as you're kind of taking us through this post-apocalyptic world. And so, as you sort of started to describe, I'm curious to hear a little bit more about how the story took shape and the, I guess, feeling of like playing out what might happen for you. Was it exciting? Was it comfort? Was it scary?
It was surprisingly hard. So when I was first sort of approached about the story, was one that I kind of wrote specifically for Adi, and we were talking about sort of what is it that we often don't think about when we think about climate solutions. Who is it that we don't always, which perspectives do we never take into consideration, and then how could that end up creating more problems in some ways than we already have. So we started sort of spitballing ideas around like climate catastrophes that never get or don't get as much play as they should, or don't get as much attention as we should. And the climate catastrophe of sand is one that's actually happening right now. And so the way I thought about it was, okay, what if we focused on petrochemicals but ignored sand, and sort of left that out there, and how would that metastasize? So it's set in a world that I have sort of written in before. I've conceptualized, what Nigeria might look like in 50 years in in 100 years, sort of taking certain trends, pushing them forward, looking at demographics, for instance, things that people don't always think about, or at least things that people look at and say, oh, the thing that we're seeing now will just continue on, without change for the next 100 years, which we all know is not actually how human beings and time works. So a big part of thinking through the story was really just thinking about what is it that we are not paying attention to, and what is it that we're not really, it seems, willing to change, and how will that affect the future that we all kind of hoping to see. And one of the things I've noticed is that we're not really challenging, we are in a way, but not in significant ways enough, challenging like corporate capitalist structures enough. And what if the greenwashing that a lot of corporations are trying to do is ultimately successful, so we don't actually change the system, but we just change the source of power. Yeah, and that was kind of where my thinking was, really.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that speculative narratives of this kind could be quite useful for thinking through and shaping policy. I wonder if you agree.
Absolutely. I mean, when we think about some of the technologies we see today, a lot of them were inspired by the science fiction of 50, 60 years ago. Steve Jobs talks about seeing a communicator on Star Trek and being inspired to create the iPhone. So I think that speculative futures and speculative fiction intertwines with innovation and technology really, really closely. I often say that we can't work towards a future that we can't imagine, and so the work of the imagination is often an important but maybe neglected part of what we try to do. And one of the things that speculative fiction is really, really good at is asking us, okay, if we go this route that we are proposing, if this policy comes to fruition, if this trend continues without change, what is the future that we're going to be seeing? And oftentimes we like dystopias in that sense, because we can imagine the worst things that could happen if we don't change. Sometimes it's harder to imagine the better things, and the things that if one thing gets better and another thing gets worse, sometimes that can be a little harder for us to really think through. So yeah, I think speculative imagining is critically important to policy, and particularly to climate policy, in ways that I don't know are often addressed as much as maybe they should be at some of the highest levels.
I think that's fascinating. Yeah. And kind of a great place to sort of wrap up. There is one interesting question that is in the chat that I'd like to pose, which sort of speaks to, I think, this question of imagining alternatives. What can the rest of the world learn from approaches like Guna Yala's? Not every place has their relationship with the forest. How do they share their knowledge in ways that can be utilized elsewhere? And obviously, Ruxandra, please answer this question. But I think sort of more broadly, thinking about cross-pollination and sharing approaches and strategies that may seem like they belong in one place, but could actually be used elsewhere is a question that I think we can all reflect on a bit. So maybe Ruxandra, you could start us off.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. I'll just say that what struck me the most about the traditions and way of life and identity of the Guna, and something that has been foundational to their people and still is today, is the the nightly gathering, there is high civic participation in that community, even amongst Guna who leave the islands, right? Looking for jobs, looking to go to college. So participation, I can't think of, participation and a love for art and imagination and poetry, thinking back to everything that's been said here, right? Like having this ability both to engage physically and emotionally in the moment with your people, and then also being able to dream up other possibilities. I mean, I can't, considering everything that's at stake and in our personal and shared dreams, and this fearful moment we're living through, right? And in relation to the climate crisis and everything else. I can't imagine what I'd do if it wasn't for beauty, and finding different ways to see it in the world, whether it's through my peers or through things I read, watch, think about. So, that's a very esoteric answer to your question, but I was thinking about that this I think civic participation and genuinely caring and doing our part is what's going to save us. And that's something that I've seen in the Guna and that I greatly respect.
Mm. Chinelo or Anna, do you have anything you want to add or leave us with?
Maybe a small thing. I think Chinelo maybe should leave us with something, but I just wanted to, I have been listening and of course thinking about the issue, and especially in this conversation, it occurred to me how much the issue is about resistance and different ways of resistance, especially palpable as we're talking about catastrophe, and we're talking about such a disturbing and profoundly sad situation, right? That we have co-created. But I, just listening to Chinelo and listening to Ruxandra and Tamara and everybody who has spoken and all the people who have contributed to the issue, seems to me that we're all envisioning, Chinelo is talking about imagining the future. I think that resistance is absolutely important and necessary to imagine a future. So I'm really grateful for this conversation and how it fleshed out this aspect of it. Thank you.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. I think, especially as we were talking about, COP23 and we are watching world leaders sort of do this theater a little bit, and with no real outcome in sight. We do this every year. We all gather, we all wait, and then nothing happens and nothing changes, and then we come back and have the same conversations again. I think that finding ways to creatively think about how we in some ways save ourselves, because status quo is not going to change, not when there's so much profit on the line. And imagination is critically important to that, and looking not just backwards to Indigenous and traditional forms of knowledge, but forwards to how those things can be applied in an incredibly unstable and changing environment is really, really, really important. I think that the work is already being done. I mean, by hearing everybody here, I think the work is being done brick by brick by brick, and we can't afford to lose hope. We can't afford to give in to negativity. We can't afford to believe the dystopias that we're constantly presented with. I think it is on us to imagine better, and from there work towards that in whatever ways that we can. I try to do my part a little bit by, by writing stories that are set in worlds where some of these things have already been figured out. And in that way, we can look forward to a future that does exist. Because I think there's a lot of messaging out there that tries to tell us that if we don't stay with the systems that already exist, there will be nothing. There's this or nothing. And I think it's really, really important for us to resist that sort of messaging, because it's damaging and it's soul sapping, and it's just not true. So thank you for doing this, and thank you for continuing this work. It's so important.
Thank you all so much for being here today, and thank you, audience, for staying with us. Yeah, just really grateful for all of the contributions to this issue, and please go and explore and read Adi magazine and follow us as we continue. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great evening and be well.
You too. Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.